Unfortunately, I grew up in a rather non-exciting area. I grew up in Orange County and in the suburb, and grew up in a pretty modest household, and with a brother and a sister.
Hmm.
Architecture was, what's interesting about that question is architecture for me was pretty obvious when I was young.
Hmm.
I loved Legos. I was obsessed with perfectionism and, not kind of understanding what that meant at the time. But a close family friend was an architect and he would build models. And I was able to sneak down there to their house every once in a while. I'd walk down the street and he had this loft and I would climb up the loft and surprise him a few times, but I was able to kind of sit there and watch him work. And I was fascinated and I was hooked. Um,
Really cool.
it was amazing. Yeah. And so he was a very big influence on me, whether he knows it or not. But I think for me, just watching him work and the precision and the creativity was, it felt like my brain just kind of felt like that was where I felt most comfortable.
So for some context, like how old were you when this was happening?
Yeah. I would say that I was probably 10, 11,
Okay. Yep. Yep.
fairly young. Growing up, for me, the idea of, I grew up in this kind of sports household where it was very sports driven and that's an understatement actually. And so creativity was something that I always possessed, but didn't really know how to communicate it. And architecture was the one kind of space that made me feel that I can communicate in a way that maybe my parents didn't understand, or kind of family friends and other people in the neighborhood.
That's really cool because the following question is always, did you have any parents or siblings who were in a creative industry or anything like that?
No, actually, quite the opposite. My father was worked for a water company, and my mother was a teacher.
Hmm.
She taught special ed, and so really for me it's very interesting growing up in that household. I mean, I got a lot from that, but definitely wasn't anything really related to architecture specifically.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Hmm.
at 10 to 11 years old, did you really understand what that family friend architect was actually doing? Like,
Or
you
was it
know,
just like really cool, you know?
or it was just like, making stuff and it
Yeah,
was kind of magical.
I think it was really cool. But I think I think at first, for me, it was interesting because it was the idea of, it was sort of um, for me, it was the idea of creation. And I think, when you're young, you don't really understand what that is.
Hmm.
I think, there's certain outlets when you're younger, such as I brought up Legos, and it's something I would be obsessed with, and I would spend hours and hours and sort of get lost in my own world. And I think that was my idea of creation when I was younger. And then when I turned 10 and 11 and 12 and kind of getting in those stages of junior high and high school, I think you're trying to look for that new outlet. And I think when I saw him working on these models, I thought, wow, this is exactly what I want to do. This is creation. This is, you're building something, and it happens to be, it's this intersection of precision and creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And that just kind of struck me as, and again, I think David, you said it was cool. But then I quickly realized the impact of architecture as I started getting older and older.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where in Orange County are you from? Because I'm from Orange County.
Okay, I'm from a town called Cypress.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, I'm from Orange. So yeah, when you
Okay,
said suburbia, I'm like, yeah, it's Orange County.
well, that's very cool. My mom went to Sunny Hills High School and was from Fullerton, and
Okay.
I did my thesis actually on Joseph Eichler, which I'm sure you're familiar with living in Orange. You
Oh,
Yeah.
probably grew up around a
yes.
lot of Joseph Eichler homes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great thesis project. We'll have to get into that. Um,
Yeah.
so architecture bit you from a pretty young age. Was it clear when you were in high school that you were going to study that for college? Like that was the path?
Well, I mean, in my mind, it was. I don't think it was in my parents' mind. I think, going back to the kind of sports analogy, I think if there was a sport to be played, I was playing it at a very high level. And my brother went to school for a full scholarship in football. And so I think that
Wow.
my dad's thought process was that, that I was going to kind of follow in his footsteps. And I think it took me many years to build the courage to tell him that, I was sort of done, kind of hanging up the jersey, and that architecture was going to be this thing for me. I think it was pretty foreign to my father at that point. And it was a difficult conversation, but certainly was the right decision.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what sports you played, but as I say, football to architecture, they're pretty different things.
I played them all. So,
Okay.
yeah, I played them all. If you can think of one, I probably played it. So, but I think it's interesting that there's a lot to be learned from playing sports and applying some of the things you learn in sports to architecture and running a
Really?
business. And absolutely. Yeah, I think, sports teaches you a lot about teamwork and leadership and
Hmm.
winning and losing, which is really important in life to understand. Teaches you about commitment. And so I think there's a whole host of kind of character building traits that you get from playing in sports, and at the level that we played them at. I think it was very easy for me to apply those to architecture and and kind of the practice that we have today.
It's one of the things I don't follow sports very closely outside of mixed martial arts, which is like the most violent thing. But one of the attributes of athletes I think that fascinates me is their level of discipline and dedication. And I don't think a lot of people fully understand how disciplined these kinds of people are.
You hit the nail on the head. I think that is the reason why I kind of went away from sports, because I think that I didn't have the discipline to take that next step, and I think a lot of that was because I think I was preoccupied with architecture and kind of the creative process, and wanting to take my kind of commitment to that place. And my brother, I referenced him a second ago. He's very disciplined, and there's a big reason why he was very successful in sports and successful today because of that discipline. But you're absolutely right. I think about this all the time. My dad used to, before the school year, he would make us come up and put 10 goals on his nightstand before the year started. And he quickly let us know that goals are meant, you're trying to reach them. You don't have to reach all of them. But if you reach some of them in the process of trying to reach the kind of ones that are not really attainable, you're going to reach other ones that you didn't create. And so, I use that today, those same principles in my practice. Yeah.
Interesting.
So do you still do the list of goals like right now and in December before the next year?
Great question. Yeah, I do
Oh.
actually. Yeah, and I think it's a practice that I don't write them out and put them on my nightstand, but but I definitely have goals. Typically I'm setting those every few months. And so it's definitely it's a learned behavior that was instilled in me early on, and I'm still using it today.
That's fantastic.
That's pretty cool.
So you're in high school and you end up going to USC, is that right?
Correct.
How did that transition happen? How did you decide on USC? What was it like when you got there?
Well, USC was, from my perspective, really just a fantastic school. I think, and not just a fantastic university, but also a fantastic architecture school. And I thought, if I can train with the best, that's only going to bring out the best in me. And so for me, going to USC was a priority. I think getting to USC was a wake-up call, because everybody in the class is very talented. They're all very smart. They're all very hardworking. And so you're surrounded by this sort of think tank of really smart, driven young adults. And that can either, you can either rise to that occasion or that can, make you kind of crumble and crawl into a shell. And I think that for me, it was, obviously I wanted to rise to that occasion with the kind of the talent around me. And so getting to USC was great. Some of my best friends today are from USC School of Architecture. We all kind of keep in contact today, and that speaks volumes about the quality of kids that were at that school when we were there.
Did you have prior training or experience drawing model making. You had some model making, I suppose, maybe vicariously through your friend growing up. But, if some kids come into school and they're just naturally gifted or they have a lot of training in art class and whatnot, did you have that kind of background on day zero?
I did a lot of, in high school, there was drafting classes, and I definitely did a lot of that. And but other than that, not really. I think, which I think you can argue is better, right? I think you're sort of just a blank canvas, and I think that's almost better in architecture school. I'm sure there's different opinions on that subject, but I think going to architecture school really, I always say that, going to USC, being in LA raised me. I always like to tell people, for better or for worse. And USC was a big part of that. And so I think the raising portion is, you're sort of maturing, at school and maturing and developing, your process while you're at school. You don't even know what's happening.
And the campus itself is so central in Los Angeles. For people who maybe aren't familiar with like the geography of Southern California, like USC is smack dab in the middle. And so when you get outside of the campus, it's Los Angeles. It's urban. There's people, there's cars, there's craziness.
Very urban. And that was, well, I think that's also part of why USC's, School of Architecture is great, because I think there's a lot of culture around you, and I think you're sort of surrounded by it. You can't run from it, and I think it's a great thing, especially coming from where I was raised, where I would say there's sort of a void of culture, and I think I look back at that now, I can say that honestly, I don't think I realized that then, but certainly going to LA and being surrounded by the city and the sounds and the good and the bad, I think was something that accelerated our process of creativity at USC.
And that program's a 5-year, is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Were there any surprises in the years from 1 to 5? Was it more challenging than when you expected? Was the processes different?
It's interesting because I think, our class, I've heard from multiple, classes in different kind of 5, 6, 7, 8 years of classes. And our class was very competitive. And a lot of professors, kind of refer to our year. And so I think to answer your question on the kind of any surprises, I think really it was quickly in like year 2, you realized how talented this class was, and that, in order to do well at this, in the studio or in this program, you were going to have to elevate. You didn't have a choice. From a surprise standpoint, I think we did have one professor that typically handpicked his studio, and he was the most difficult professor at USC, and he chose, he put me in a studio 3 different times, and I think it was painful, but I at the end of the day, really appreciated, what I learned from him and how it pushed me and made me feel uncomfortable. And, and I think you look back now and you realize how helpful that was in my development.
I'm curious to who that was.
I'm not saying.
Fair enough.
Nice try, David.
When you were in school, were things still being done by hand, like hand drafting with Maylines and these kinds of things, or was the computer in the fold?
Yeah, David, it's a great question. I think that's something that my business partner, we talk about often, that we were one of the last classes actually at USC to do ink on mylar. And so, and there's something, powerful about that, because it forces you to be rational with what you're designing. It forces you to understand what you're designing, because once it's down on the mylar, it's down. And so in a way, the lack of technology, we were our class was really kind of I would say that the forefront of kind of the technology boom in architecture, where, model making machines and all of these things were really kind of new when we were leaving. So no one really used them. So, our 5th year thesis was, ink on mylar. I've saved it. It's beautiful. But yeah, we were one of the last classes at USC to do ink on mylar.
That's incredible. And ink on mylar and Maylines, like some of these terms have come up recently on the show with our guests, but maybe can you explain for the younger listeners who aren't quite sure what you're talking about, and why would drafting something that's via ink on mylar, why would that be productive or helpful? Because it would also sounds on the surface kind of just archaic, and like it would just take a long time, you know?
Well, it is archaic and it does take a long time. So, in the most simplistic form, it's sort of the roots of architecture and how you communicated your work. And ink on mylar, you had to understand line weights differently than maybe line weights in AutoCAD or Revit. And I think there's an inherent growth that you get from that because it forces you to understand how architects communicate or how they used to communicate. And so ink on mylar was it's really kind of it represents a finality of the work, right? So the process is completed and ink on mylar is suggesting that there's a finality to the design. And so I think there's something there and it really just speaks to the way that the architects have always communicated, quite frankly.
That's interesting. The finality, that aspect is interesting because it's actually quite easy to produce something at the computer. It's not easy, but to do that and then to print it and be like, oh, I'm just going to reprint. And you just keep reprinting and you make small edits. And I feel like sometimes in the computer space, even with printing, you're always living in an infinite number of revisions. And there's not that kind of finality that you're describing.
Yeah. And I think there's, I often have this discussion with a lot of different folks in the office. And obviously we have different generations in our office. And really the question is technology in a way more difficult in many respects today to deal with in architecture because there's this idea that things are always in process. And so your brain or the way that you work through something maybe is a little more casual. But then the flip side is that technology allows for you to study conditions and details and that you otherwise maybe would not be able to see unless you were in 3D and were able to psychoanalyze every aspect of the design, right? So,
so sticking with the story, you finished at USC. What was the next step afterwards?
My first job was with Altoon Porter Architects. They were in downtown LA and they were a fairly large firm, did a lot of commercial work. I was pretty excited to work there. It was an opportunity for me. They'd just been awarded a contract for the Olympics in China.
Wow.
And so it was so quickly I asserted myself to get on that team and I was able to work on the Olympics in China. And that was a great experience for me, learning experience. Quickly you have to jump into a team that's of 30, 40 people. And, it's between LA and China and there's communication that's happening around the clock. And so it was sort of baptism by fire, so to speak, out of school, so that was, I worked for them for close to 2 years. My wife, my girlfriend at the time, went back to business school at Duke in North Carolina. And so I was going to quit because I was going to go move back to North Carolina. And I approached Ron Altoon and let him know that I was going to quit. And I had been flying back to see my wife on kind of weekends and red eyes, and he was like, "What took you so long?" And so it was. I was so scared to tell him, and he then said, "Well, do me a favor, give me 90 days in Brussels. We had an office in Brussels, and so he said, I'll fly you back to North Carolina. You can start your life with your wife." And so I lived in Brussels and worked for Altoon Porter there. We worked on a few projects in Moscow.
Whoa.
It was a great experience living in Brussels and just kind of culturally just jumping into it. My roommate was born and raised in Brussels, and so it was just really great for me to kind of get outside of the shell and experience something new architecturally and also culturally. So that was the next step.
It's a big step.
The weather is definitely very different between LA and Brussels.
Well, I'll tell you, I told, talking to my mom, I think, when I was there, and I said, "Mom, I don't think I've seen the sun for 45 days." So when I was there, it was awfully cold, and it was definitely a reminder how beautiful Southern California is.
Yeah, that's true.
So, yeah.
What kind of projects were you working on? Like they were mostly large scale things?
Yeah, a lot of what Altoon Porter did was kind of public space architecture,
Hmm.
and they had a kind of wide range. They did a lot of these like major developments with some, Four Seasons and then a mall attached to it, or a shopping center.
Hmm.
So they were, typically these projects were fairly large and required a tremendous amount of effort with some large teams.
Did you know after you graduated, like the type of office and projects that you were most interested in, or you just kind of had no idea what was out there?
Yeah, and I think that's something I think all young architects face when they
Hmm.
graduate is what kind of architecture gets me excited, or where do I want to see my career go in architecture? Because there's so many different avenues today to look into, and the things we always talk about where your eyes light up, right? And I think working at Altoon Porter was it was a great experience for me. I loved working there, but what it did was it proved that the process of working on large teams was really not for me.
Hmm.
And that type of architecture, there was a lack of connection for me in that architecture, because to me, architecture is not about the building, but it's about the people that you're designing for and designing with.
Hmm.
And so, I was sort of torn, because but what it did was it was sort of a relief, because it proved that residential, or going back to going into residential, was where I needed to be.
Hmm. So, what more specifically about the large scale work was a turnoff? Was it I don't know, the clients being kind of a faceless entity? Was it the scale? I mean, what about it?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. I think it's, not having access to the clients. There's definitely a lack of connection. I think you need to be connected in architecture.
Hmm.
I think, when you're designing for somebody, if anything, I think you want to know who you're designing for, why you're designing it. Like, and I think that makes you a better designer.
Hmm.
That was the first thing. The scale, is challenging, because you can be working on a stair for, months, right? And you're proud of that stair, don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
but I think it's challenging. So I think, there's in my opinion, and this is not certainly what everybody feels, but maybe a lack of ownership, in the overall project.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I think I struggled with that.
That's a really good point. And I mean, there's certainly exceptions to that, of course, but I feel like it's a very common trait of large projects, simply because, for a lot of reasons, just the amount of documentation or work that has to take place. It really is, at some point, it comes down to just, people power. How many people do you have to execute this thing? And it can get lost and become without a stronger sense of authorship, like you were saying.
Yeah, and also to add to that, and not to take anything away from the scale, because I think if you really think about what we created, or what people create in large firms and these large projects, it's nothing short of amazing,
Sure.
because of the amount of people that it takes to execute these details. I mean, I'm sure it certainly makes me look at like a stadium differently.
Yeah.
And right? When you see a stadium, you think, wow, like what did it take to get there? Right?
So rocket ship is what that is.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember we worked in New York for a period of time at large offices, and there's a handful of projects that, I mean, bigger projects take a longer period of time. Although, that said, some of the houses you guys do probably take a while as well. But there's some projects that are large, and they get cursed, and they just last forever, and they get passed down to different teams.
Different generations.
Different generations, because,
Yeah.
employees, they come and go. And this, like you were saying the other day, Marina, like there was one tower you had worked on, and it had been touched by, I don't know how many different architects within that same office that are no longer around.
So talking about authorship,
Yeah, it's very...
if you did that one handrail right, you gotta
Yeah.
get credit for that. No, but that makes sense, and I think also the feeling of not satisfied, but kind of like the rewards of designing for, let's say, a private client, someone you have more direct contact with.
Hmm.
the reward or the what you get back from that relationship and the design you produce from that is much more. I think to me it's bigger and it's more direct than when you designed for a faceless client or like a very large scale building where maybe a lot of people are going to enjoy it, but you're never going to get that feedback from them. And I think that's something that kind of like keeps us going, right? Like, why do we keep designing a building that, take forever and spend so much time and effort into it? It's also for that kind of like human rewards, I feel.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point. I think it's funny because there's discussions about authorship and culture, because culture of an office, because with a lack of authorship, you often see an erosion of culture, because with people leaving because they're not feeling connected to a project, it's oftentimes hard to keep that synergy in the office. And so again, these are all observations, but I think they're certainly, it makes those larger firms so much more impressive to me, because it's so difficult to keep that engine turning, right? And I think that, but then again, the architecture a lot of these firms are doing are just so exciting, and they're so public facing, and I think there's something to that gets people really excited as well.
You bring up a really good point about authorship and its connection to the culture of an office. That's super well said, and I've never thought about it quite that directly. How do you, we just skipped over a bunch of the story, but how do you, as an office leader, create a space where people feel like they have that level of authorship, but at the same time, having some kind of coherency across all of the projects in the studio so they aren't totally random and different from one another?
Well, that is the question, right?
Yes.
Because, right, that's the answer to success of most practices. And I think one thing that we focus on heavily in our office is culture, and culture happens for a variety of reasons, but you can trace that culture back to, you can simplify it right down to use authorship for a second. In our office, we make it clear that we want to make sure everybody feels ownership of every project they work on, whether you're a first year just graduating or you've been in the office for 6-7 years. The idea is not just about, did you design this project, but what are you learning, and how fast can we get you to the place where you're having more and more ownership of that project. You start really kind of small and then you build up. And so for us, it's important in our office. What we try to do is we try to analyze everybody differently. There's no one size fits all, right? And just like somebody graduates from School of Architecture, one person may be really excited about design, and someone may be really technical and excited about digging into bolt connections. And I think that both of those are extremely valuable assets to an office. But we try early on to find out where each team member's eyes light up, and we try to encourage them to move in that direction, and that allows for the team member to feel more ownership of the project, and moving forward and growth in the office.
Yeah, amazing. So you're in Brussels. Was there ever a moment? Was there ever a moment
the gray weather
that you thought that you would try and stick there, or that you guys would relocate there, or remain there for a longer period of time? No.
No, I was. I think for me, moving to Durham, because after I left Brussels, I moved to Durham and lived in Durham for 1.5 years, and I worked for a firm called Little Architects, and I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they're a large firm. It's ironical, the irony of it all. They're called Little, but they were also a larger firm that worked on larger projects, a lot of university stuff, and which was very exciting, to be honest with you. And I really immersed myself into the culture of Durham, North Carolina, and we loved our time there, and I loved working there. I loved the people. I loved the architecture that we were working on and working towards. And but once that was done and my wife had graduated, she had her job back in LA, and LA was home where where my family was from. And I remember driving across country and getting to LA and seeing my wife, and said, I think this is time for us to for me to start my own practice, and that's really how it started.
Well, so how many years were you practicing at other offices before you decided to launch your own?
Total of altogether probably 4 years.
Okay. Yeah.
Wow.
That's
4 years,
actually
fairly
pretty
quick.
quick compared
Yeah.
to most architects' stores, I feel like.
Yeah, and I think there's something that we did probably skip over that, I've been pretty, even when I was in school, I was, I was working on a project while I was there. That was my own project. And so I had a
Hmm.
family member who allowed me to do an addition, and it was my way of looking at a new, a new world of brise soleil on this house. And, the family member was so generous and kind to let me, really kind of explore some creative alternatives to architecture in their house. And so I've always been really motivated and someone that really kind of, for me, it was important to continue to work and develop and work on projects. And so I think my thirst was just after those 4 years, I was just really ready for it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because the question of when to start one's own practice varies, person by person. But there a lot of architects, I think, especially if doing larger work, the way you go about it is you practice for like 10 or 15 years at an office, and then you branch off. And at that point, you're branching off, but you're pulling with you all of your connections that you've had on the professional side and the client side and everything. And it's let's say easy transition in a way, easier.
Yeah, and that is easier. I definitely didn't take the easier transition. Certainly, I think from a financial standpoint, my wife was working, so fortunately we were able to support the family. But I think starting the practice, we talk about this all the time that I didn't take a paycheck for 3 years,
Wow.
and so
Wow.
I think maybe that adds to your addition of 4 + 3. So we're at 7 years now of kind of, let's say,
Or
not really doing anything and trying to work for myself. But I think that's all part of the story.
And did you start the office with Joseph from the day
Yes.
zero? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So Joe, the background there is we went to school together at USC. We were close friends at school. We've been best friends since. And really, Joe's not a friend, he's a brother. And so we've known each other for 20, I guess not 20, it's scary to say, 22 years, 23 years. And we've been at each other's weddings and our kids are growing up together. And so there's a brotherhood between the two of us, and that's communicated in our office and the way that we work through projects.
Wow, that's awesome.
That's really cool.
So were you guys the same year in school? Like, did you have studios together?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you guys are really tight then.
We were on all those studios together, the ones that I told you about. So yeah, it was competitive before it was friendly, let's say.
Okay. Who was the better designer in school?
You can ask him.
Did you guys have a chance to do projects together in school before launching an office?
So that's a great question. When we launched the office, originally the concept was that I was going to go out on my own, but I knew I wanted a partner. To run a practice, and we were at that time, still hanging around LA with our friends and barbecuing, and I believe it was we were having a barbecue and we're drinking some beer and just talking about joining up and starting to practice. And what we did was there are these properties in Laurel Canyon called the Encyclopedia Britannica properties, because long time ago when you bought a piece of property, they would give you a volume of Encyclopedia Britannicas. And this is like tells you what land cost a long time ago, which is really makes everybody mad. But but these properties were really thin and narrow, and so they were oftentimes unbuildable. And so we identified a lot that we basically rented pro forma and designed a home that would fit on that lot. We reached out to the real estate agent and we talked about creating funding for it. And so I think during that exercise of finding that property, designing, working it through construction documents, trying to find funding, we developed our language and we also developed our kind of bond as partners.
Wow.
And so that was really the start of, we actually have that model in our office. We keep it around just for memory. Yeah.
That's really cool. Did you guys find enough funding to do it? What happened with the
No,
project?
no, no, we did not. But it was, what was great. It was a bit of the exercise, was a way for us to develop a lot of things in the business and the way that we wanted to run the practice. And, quickly this one little small 2,500 square foot home, from that design exercise created a whole host of other conversations about what we were looking for from the practice. What do we want from it? What are things that we want to carry over from our other offices that we thought were positive, the things that were negative. And so this little home was this sort of spark that lit the flame for Woods Dangaran today.
That's fascinating. Awesome. Was those the things you learned from that project, did that occur because maybe that was because you guys essentially were the client and therefore you had to make all the decisions on your own? I'm thinking now, like when you're a student and you do projects together or with your best friend or whatever it is, there's a brief. It's fairly constrained, or it's outlined this in terms of like the direction or the parameters. And obviously when you work on a real project with a client, they have a heavy hand in what gets approved and doesn't get approved. But if you're doing like a spec house on your own, I guess it's just up to you to make all the decisions.
Yeah, it's a great question. That was a big part of developing the philosophy for our office. And that house, the way it was designed was we called it the house of minimums, because we framed the house as if we were, going back to the Joseph Eichler conversation or mention of Joseph Eichler and what he means to architecture today and kind of mass production of great architecture. But really the idea of this house was to design something that was rational, something that we were familiar with and that we were comfortable with from a design perspective. But the house of minimums, what that meant was all the lumber was 8-foot lumber. And so we were using, and all of the engineering that we designed were type 5, they were called worksheet details, structural details. So nothing was steel, it was all wood frame. So really, from our perspective, it was an exercise in discipline and rational exploration of what this house could be on this property.
Is that project on your guys' website?
It's not on our website. It's not. It's not on our website. But we have some early renderings, which we'll have to dust off in the server somewhere and look at them. And we thought they were great when we did them. I'm sure they're probably fairly laughable at this point. But
I'm sure people will be very, very interested to see that, the spark of the practice. That's wonderful.
But so the idea of doing this project was really to just kind of like work up what the office was going to be about, or were you guys really planning to get it funded and built, and like how high were the hopes, in starting?
They were high. The hopes were high. We wanted to build it.
Yeah.
And we went as far as meeting with the realtor that was selling the property, and we pitched it to him, and and I thought, I think we thought that this was a great opportunity for us to use as a kind of a showpiece for this new practice that we were going to start.
Yeah.
And so I think it started from a business sense, and really kind of what came from that was less business. Well, there was some business, but it was more kind of the creative spark of our office.
And actually, on that note, you had just mentioned that a little bit of business came out from this exercise. So what happened as a result of doing it?
Well, forced us to create budgets. It forced us to, really to analyze the structure and to make sure that it was feasible, which is very difficult to do, as any of us know, especially when you're young and you're just out of school and you think you know everything. But I think what it did was it just sped up the process, I think, for us. I don't think it changed what the process is for most people starting a practice, but I think it just sped it up. And quickly, when you jump into something as serious as development, when there's real money at stake, it forces you to take things seriously. It forces you to consider, all of the positives and negatives and all the things that could go wrong, um, which I think is really a great lesson.
Yeah, that's a really good point because if you are always practicing as a typical architect, which is hard enough on its own, but you don't necessarily gain the insight that you're describing of being the one that's responsible for how much money goes into the thing. That's a different feeling.
Yeah, and also how architecture can influence a budget, right? I think that oftentimes in school, going back to kind of the idea of maybe at our school it's called pro practice, and it was a class that we took, I think, third and fourth year. I think it should be every year, and I think because I think it's oftentimes a lot of students are leaving the schools ill-equipped for what the business side of architecture really is, and it's interesting because there's a conversation about a lot of architects leaving and wanting to do something really special, and I think that's really fantastic. But there's definitely this intersection of creativity and also the kind of real world, and those two have to align for you to be able to do something special, and that isn't communicated too often enough in school, and partly because I think there's just a lot to learn in school, and there's just not enough time, and so the real world will teach you quickly. But I think that's something that I've learned over the years, certainly.
Yeah, I like that point. I like that point a lot, and I agree that there's some probably valid reasons and good reasons as to why some of the professional challenges are not embedded within undergraduate school, at least as much, because there's so much to learn anyway. But I think it makes it a difficult thing to transition then, because a lot of folks, either you sink or swim. Either you learn the stuff as you have, or a lot of folks, they don't, and they never start their own practice therefore, or they just stay in the academic space because it's, getting through architecture school is difficult. And you finish, you're like super excited, you made it through, then you're hit with a whole new wave of new things. You're like, oh man, what?
I think it just depends on the tool set that you have when you leave. And some kids graduate and either they were raised in a house of architects, or they have adjacent, sort of family members who are architects, or they, whether they're successful at a certain level of success. And I think that impacts your confidence when you leave school as well, as to what you pursue, I think. But I agree, it's very interesting. There's sort of the world of academia and then sort of the world of architecture. And there's this big kind of gap between as to what fills that space. And so, it's always, I feel very fortunate, as well as I'm sure Joe as well. We feel very fortunate to be in this position. We've worked really hard, and we've had our heads down for 13 years building this practice. There's been a lot of hard work and a little bit of luck, and but at the same time, that's not the same story for every student that graduates.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I want to talk about your guys' work because you do residential. Do you guys do other types of projects as well on occasion, or not really?
Not on occasion. I mean, we don't currently, but we are interested in getting into more public buildings. I mean, galleries and maybe some libraries and stuff like that. So I think we're very interested in it. We will be pursuing that in the future, but currently it's high in residential.
Ooh, a Woods Dangaran library.
Oh, that sounds
I
really
like
cool.
that idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, we think the way that we look at a structure translates to some of these kind of more public commercial buildings, and kind of the rational way that we look at homes. We think is transfers over. So.
And so the focus on single family residential kind of to date, let's say, and even more specifically, the type of single family residential, it's modern, and it's closely associated a lot of times with mid-century modern more specifically. And I'm kind of curious because if people read blogs and articles about you, mid-century is very closely tied to Woods Dangaran. Do you guys think of yourselves that way, or?
No.
Okay. No. Interesting.
Yeah. I think so. I get for me, Joe knows this. I get a kick out of that when I read articles, and Look, I think let me just first say that it's an honor that people look at us as sort of carrying the torch for mid-century architecture. And I think there's a lot of what we do philosophically that's very similar to some of the mid-century greats that you see in LA, and kind of this living museum in LA of wonderful case study homes. Certainly that was our start. And I think we've done a lot of work. So we worked on some Elwoods, and I think it's important for us to participate in restoring and being a part of restoring a lot of the mid-century homes that have been in LA and help sort of define the fabric of LA's architecture. And I think I think where it comes from is a lot of the kind of philosophical beginnings of the way that we look at floor plans and homes does come from mid-century designs. But I think we've been tagged as the mid-century architects, which I can't say that we aren't or we are. I just think that we're less mid-century, we're more sort of modern in the way that we look at homes and structures.
It's interesting because, I feel like oftentimes when we talk to clients or potential clients, like one of the first questions is, what's your style? Right. And that's kind of a question that annoys me, honestly, because...
Well, it's a question I never once thought about in my entire life until we started a practice. Because when we worked at offices, the offices we worked at were, I don't know, places like KPF and whatnot. So no one was doing like classical architecture. And so this question of style, it in the beginning, it blindsided us. We're like, what? I don't know. We do contemporary, modern style,
Yeah, I think we get that question all the time, and it can be challenging to answer. I think that the best way to answer that for us is we approach every property the same way, and every home takes on an architectural character that relates to not just its surroundings and the city, the property, the adjacencies, but also the client as well. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of what we do, we always tell clients that we are modernists. Right. But plenty of modernists don't live in flat modern homes. Mm-hmm. Right. And so for us, we like to use the analogy that, if you want to do a proper Spanish style house, we would love to work on that. But as long as it is actually accurate to the time. Mm. And so I think that's where maybe we're a bit of a purist when it comes to the work that we do and how it's communicated. But I would say that we are modernists. What that really means, I think, is interesting today, because I think everybody has a lot of different definitions of what that might mean. I have one, but I think everybody else has a lot of them, So,
well, that's a good point, though, because I think the word modern has, and correct me if I'm mistaken, but in the people I've spoken with, they associate the word modern with mid-century modern, and I have to think to myself, well, that's not totally it. That's different.
Yeah, modernism is a lot of things, and what it is to us, it's just rational design that is tectonic. It's expression of structure. It's not playful, and typically, if you apply those principles to working through a floor plan and also the kind of the three-dimensionality of the building, you're going to end up with something that is very controlled and rational, which are some of the principles of modernism. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a challenge. What the issue today, I mean, maybe it's not an issue, but I guess maybe the thing today is, there's a lot of also, modernism out there that's pretty bad. And I think people think that's what modernism is. Mm-hmm. And I think what it does, it sets you back a little bit, because it does a disservice to kind of all the modern greats that have come before us and have created this wonderful language. And so, you can meet someone and they can see this home that's this, box, and they think that's modern. And to us, it's not. And so it's a matter of just education. Mm-hmm. And I think that's always what it's about, is just educating.
I was going to ask you that, do you have to kind of give them a crash course of what is modernism and what are the principles and the things that you guys are looking at?
Yeah, I think yes. I think it's not a crash course. It's a course that they take over the lifespan of the project. And it's, we don't expect on day one for a client to understand what those principles are, what they mean to us. I think we know through conversation and kind of having those conversations about what they're looking for and how we're working through it, and they can see how we can systematically work through something, but very rationally and in a linear sense. I think it becomes obvious, and so we don't try to win the war. We try to win the battles, and at the end of the day, 9 times out of 10, there's a complete understanding for what we're trying to accomplish and what we believe is rational architecture.
That's interesting. Rational architecture, I'm thinking maybe from the perspective of people listening, and including myself, that seems to be, what am I saying? Almost redundant in a sense. And I don't mean it as a dig, but it's like, well, how else would you approach architecture, sort of? So when you say rational architecture, is that in comparison to another way of designing that you've seen others do, which is different in some way and more based on just subjective feelings? Or
Yeah, no, it's not really a comparison between what we're doing or another office is doing. I think it's more an exploration of how we work through a floor plan, or how we align structure and make sure it's stacking. And the word rational could be used, in a floor plan. It could be used in, like I said, in stacking of structure. It can be used in the consistency of natural materials. And so, I mean, I think the word, you're right, it's a bit redundant, but it's a bit vague. It can be a bit vague or generic, but for us, there's sort of principles that we design within this office, and that's sort of one of the words that we use, and it applies really to kind of all aspects of design for us.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense because I could see that it's an easy way to maybe also explain to your own team, and you guys are working, and also maybe to the client, if it doesn't fit within this picture, oh, I want this thing. Okay, well, that has no place in this project, and it's a random material, or no, that doesn't align with the structure. Therefore, it's not what we do, or it's not as good.
Yeah, it's just not what we do. It's not about being as good. I think there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of amazing work out there today that is not what we do. And we look up to a lot of those architects and for inspiration for our office. And we use them often when we're communicating to clients. And so it's just, I think it's a way that we communicate in our practice.
Mm-hmm.
How do you kind of like make sure that the clients that come to you have that right, like the same alignment as you guys do with your work? Like, is there some sort of, I don't know, filtering, or like, do you show them images to test their reaction to the different design and see how they understand things? Like, how do you make sure that, it's not a mixed match from the beginning?
I think it happens naturally through them seeing our work.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is sort of the natural filter that you're referring to. Just the same as another architect, we're not for everyone. And certainly, so there's a lot of different architecture out there, and a lot of different clients respond positively to certain architects. And so I think typically by the time they get a chance to reach out to our office, they've seen our work, and they usually respond to what we're doing before we take that next step.
It makes sense.
A few minutes ago, if I heard correctly, you had mentioned that there are certain principles or attributes or qualities or things that you are looking for within a good floor plan from project to project. So what are some of those things?
Yeah, I that's a great question. I think it's funny because a lot of what we do, I think people must think that a lot of our projects look the same. Huh. And I think they don't. From if you're standing on the street and you're viewing one of our projects, I think they all look somewhat different. They're similar in that they're kind of quiet elevations, but the floor plans are really where we have these through lines in our office, where there's these consistencies in how we take users through a space. And so one big thing for us is, we talk about adjacencies. We spend a lot of time looking at public versus private spaces and how those are separated, but yet they still feel communal.
Mm.
We look at our floor plans and we talk a lot about taking you through a space. So if you turn a corner and there's a hallway at the end of it, what's at the end? What's bringing you through that space? There's a lot of kind of polls that we take from the floor plan while you're walking through it. So I think they're pretty simple, the principles for us, but really they're just rooted in making sure that we're being very intentional with how we bring someone through a space. And typically there's a consistency with how that works because of how we look at, how you want to access a space or how a space wants to be adjacent to another space and how does it want to feel. I think one thing that we look at a lot in our office is about views. So in LA, it's about, view properties and capturing a view. And the question for us is, well, how much is too much of a view, right? Is it more, right? Is it more powerful to frame a view or is it more powerful to give you the whole story? And so we would rather frame a view and make that feel more powerful because you're going to get the view at some point. So I think it's just kind of those design principles that we look at when we look at a new property.
I love it. That's so well said.
That's a very good point, the view thing. And I have to say that maybe that's also one of my criticism about like modernist architecture right now, especially in LA, is like just give them a big window and call it modern and that's it.
Yeah, call it modern.
But I think you're right. It comes down to the intention, and maybe that goes back to like the ink on mylar, like framing that view, sizing that perfect window at the end of the hallway to get that picture. That's very well said.
Yeah. Yeah, we talk about vignettes a lot, right? So, we like to vignette. We try to make sure that things feel in scale, in human scale. So that hallway window is in human scale or that framed view is in human scale, which to us, we feel is more powerful because that's how we experience moments is in a human scale. And so when we look at a floor plan, we're oftentimes thinking about what is that conversation that the user's having with that window and that view beyond, and is and the challenge really is communicating that to a client that is the more important, and feeling confident that they're going to feel confident in you to make that decision, because it's very difficult to give up the view. It's like the most difficult thing for a client, and because they've spent a lot of money on that view, and so it's taken us years to make sure that voice is being heard, and clients trust us on that.
So let me ask, so what happens if you're in a situation, and now most of your clients are kind of vetted because you guys are really well known, but a client says, okay, I want this big view, and you say, okay, well, we're going to frame it a certain way. They say, okay, fine. But when it comes to the meeting, they're like, no, I really want just massive floor-to-ceiling glass. Just give me the maximum square footage, inches of the glass. Like, what do you say in response?
Go outside. You get the view.
David's pressure testing me right now. Well, I think that is part of going back to the previous conversation about the kind of education of the education of a client, and I think you have to be compelling and convincing enough to make sure they understand. And I also think what helps is when you've done it before, and you can show them how successful that might be. But that does happen. And what we try not to do is act like that can't happen, because certainly this is the client's house and it's their home and that they want to live in, or the space they want to occupy. So we want to make sure they enjoy it. But we believe in the process that we have in our office that we'll actually get there. So it's a bit of a slow play, but it can happen. And it's happening, to be honest with you, it's happening less and less as our practice continues to get older and grow.
Sure.
Those conversations.
It is hard because I feel like sometimes when the client keeps bringing up the same thing and you just try to explain to them differently why this is a better way than maybe what they're suggesting, you don't want to sound like you're pushing, what your agenda on their house, right? But ultimately, like, we're more suited to know what's going to work best. So it's very difficult.
It is.
This is the double-edged sword of technology, right? We were talking about this earlier, where you have this capability in a short period of time to show more than the process is ready for. So,
Mm.
designing a home, there are steps that we believe you can't skip, and it's part of what helps create these things that we all respond positively to. But technology has given us or we have the opportunity now to present these kind of half-baked ideas, which we have found sometimes can be, set us back a little bit more because they can actually show too much when the house is not ready to be shown.
Yeah.
And so what it does is exposes more blind spots and actually proves your theory that that frame view is the way to go. And so there's also an art form of knowing when sort of, I guess, the cake is ready to take it out of the oven, right? And so I think that's where, over time you kind of learn where that moment happens.
That's very
Hopefully that
fascinating.
explains it.
Yeah. It really does. I'm curious. So what are some of the things in the process for you guys that you found were important? Specifically, talking about this last bit of the conversation with how you present your work, because some places I've seen, offices, and to each their own, but they like to show like nearly photorealistic renderings from like week 2, when something in everyone's mind in the office is clearly half baked. It's not ready to be like that, but that's like the standard. At every meeting, we have to show this level of presentation.
Right. Well, to answer I guess maybe the first part of that, which is, look, there's a tremendous amount of trust that we ask from our clients. And part of that trust is understanding that every meeting there is certain benchmarks we're trying to hit. And that, it's tough because we are also very excited and we see something developing and know it's going to be great. And we just want to kind of say, hey, here it is. But we know that that's not also maybe the best way to explain a concept or a process that we're trying to go through. But we are, I think, I don't want to say we're wrestling with this, but I think a lot of offices are wrestling with this and including ourselves about technology and how much is too much to show. Because what happens is if on, meeting 2, you show this photorealistic rendering, well, then that's the expectation for every meeting.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's just not realistic because other work has to get done to build these homes. So we're at a bit of a crossroad, to be honest with you, in the architectural world. And when it comes to technology, and how we use it in the office to communicate, because then clients are coming in and asking us, well, my friend did VR with their friend's office, and why aren't you guys doing this level of VR? And it's like, well, here's why, and so it's, I think it's going to continue to exponentially become, at the forefront of the conversation for how we communicate.
Yeah, you're probably right, because there's this, technology in these kinds of conversations is evolving so incredibly quickly. And I think there's a public perception that it's evolving and being used more quickly than it actually is. And there's this kind of false expectation or belief of like, oh, we're all in VR now.
Which also makes clients feel like things can happen faster.
Right.
Yep.
And I think that's look, there's truth to that. Certainly there's truth to how we move today. We're going back to the ink on mylar conversation and the drafting boards, and, architecture offices used to have, 20, 30 people behind drafting tables. And, they moved at a certain speed because that's how fast they can move. A lot of those drawing sets were not as fully baked because they couldn't with the time. But cut to today, with Revit and sort of a lot of technologies that we all work on, it allows for us to have leaner staffs and be able to work on more projects. The challenge becomes there's sort of the technical side of how much time is necessary to put these homes together. And then there's sort of the client facing side of, what are the expectations for what we're showing and how much of it. And, and so it's a bit of I'll be honest, it's a bit of a challenge, and maybe it's because I'm getting older. I never thought I'd be this guy, but I think we all think that it's never going to happen, but it does. And we have a lot of great staff here. Our team members are extremely talented and fresh out of school and working on programs that we never worked on. And so there's certainly an asset to that.
Interesting. I remember I was working at this office, and the deadlines were always just too soon. They were pushing a pace. The client was pushing a pace that was too aggressive, I think. And then we had this design director who, actually pretty early on in the process, he just told the client or the partner, or whoever, told them directly, said, this is too fast. We need another 2 more weeks for this this next deadline, this next meeting. And he said that's going to be the pace for the rest of this design phase. And his explanation was very simple. He said, we just need more time to reflect and to think. And that was it. And I was kind of amazed, because I think sometimes for architects, there's, I don't know, maybe there's a tendency to overthink and overcomplicate what you need to say to convince or tell somebody that I need more time. But he was so simple with it. He's like, we need more time to think and to reflect so we can do good work. And that was it. And the client was like, yeah, I get it. Fine.
Yeah. 9 times out of 10, they're going to be okay with it. And I think we talk about that all the time in our office, about setting expectations in the beginning. And we do a pretty good job of that today. I think it was difficult when we were younger, because you're sort of people pleasing, and you're trying to, everything you say, you're so worried about because you're so young, and you're trying to, the trust that you're asking for with these clients' money at a certain age makes you feel uncomfortable. And so I think that manifests itself in different ways in business. But today every client, we tell them what our standard is, and it usually is not something they want to hear, but they get over it in like 30 seconds, and that's what it is. And the way we explain it, and I think the way that your previous boss was trying to explain it, is, I think you said it, there's 2 parts to this. There's a part of thinking and thought and design. So we need time to kind of go through design process, and then we need time to produce work. So oftentimes those 2 processes are not aligned. And so working on design, usually there's a lot of, shredding, and there's a lot of problem solving, and your brain power is being taken by that and not the actual production. Yeah. And so we tell the clients that it's in their best interest to give us, we usually ask for 3 weeks between presentations, because we will have enough substance for them to review. And therefore the meeting will be that much better. So that's something that we communicate with clients immediately in the beginning. But also it depends on the type of architecture that you're working on, because there's some types of architecture that has to move fast and faster, let's say. And so 3 weeks is just not doable for some of these clients. And so fortunately, we work in a space where we can have the time to kind of create and to make sure that things we feel are right.
Do you guys ever do projects and houses for developers?
It's a great question. Earlier in our careers, I guess we're so early in our career, so
anyone under 65.
Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry. That was, I had to think about that for a second. So, early in our practice, the first few years of our practice, we did. We actually, one of the best decisions that we made was to be AOR for international architects. One thing we thought was so powerful about that for us, we were able to learn and learn from other architects and see what their drawing sets look like and see how they communicated and work directly with them. What that did was it kind of opened up this kind of other sort of avenue for us of, for other clients to see who we were and to see how professional and how we worked through a drawing set. That technical side also really kind of helped with the building of the practice, because it gave us the confidence that we needed to kind of take on any project that we felt was coming to the office from a residential side. So I think there's a few things there, but today we used to be about 70-30, 70 end user, 30 development, and now we're probably 90-10.
Wow.
And the 10 is typically AOR of a certain caliber that we'll take one project on a year or every couple of years, depending on who it is and who the architect is.
Wow, interesting.
Very
Interesting.
interesting.
Because yeah,
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say because sometimes well, doing any type of project for a developer is a very different thing than working with an end user.
Absolutely. Yeah, no question. I think, well, I think the one thing for us is that there are some, again, we talked about this, not every process is created equal and not every product is created equal. And I think, not to say that one is certainly better than the other, they're just different. And I think the process that we have in our office and the way that we work through a project doesn't necessarily lend itself to, it can lend itself to development, but we're not number one on the developers list, I guess. Let's say.
Sure,
I think
sure.
so, but I think we feel strongly that these homes, whether they're development or not, should feel like an end user home, not a development home. And so we approach every home with the same rigor that we approach the end user homes with. And so I think that's a good thing too, because at the end, the product is better. The challenge is getting over the hurdle of moving faster in the development, of cutting, maybe
Yeah.
having to build for cheaper and all that stuff.
Going back to the timeline a little bit, I'm curious to know so after you guys did that spec house that you couldn't find funding for, what was the first project that you did that got built? And then after that, which project do you think kind of, for you guys, just felt like it was like the Woods Dangaran, office project? That's from now on, that's exactly the vision that you have for the future's projects to be.
Yeah. So going back to, the office is formed. We spent the first 4 years of the office, or 3, 4 years, in a garage.
Okay.
Cool.
So it was we actually have a picture of the garage in our office that hangs on the wall, so it can be a reminder for us. But I had an apartment, and in the back, I convinced my landlord. I said, "Look, I'll pay you rent. Can I have?" And we have one of these LA, garages from back in like the 50s,
Yeah.
and so they fit like a bug. They were tiny, and I convinced her to let us do a build out. And I said I'd pay for the whole thing, and that we'd pay her. I think it was like $200 a month, and the size of the office was 7 feet by 18 feet.
Wow.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah,
Cozy.
yeah,
Yeah.
and very cozy. And that was on the outside in this like parking lot area of our apartment, and we treated that very professionally. And we are most proud of this project that I'm about to tell you about, because we signed this project. We called it Cafe Woods Dangaran because we had this little cafe table we'd bring out when clients would come, but they had like walk up the driveway of this apartment complex, and then there would be our little setup with some water and talk about being young and just sort of naive and wanting to grow and do great work. And that was the first project, was our Santa Monica project we did on 7th Street. I don't know if it's still on the website, but that was roughly a 3,800 square foot ground up home.
Wow.
Smaller, the budget was tighter, which those were the projects that we were, obviously that was where we were at in our practice. And we're very thankful for that opportunity. And we gave everything we had to that project. And we also did a project at the same time, concurrently. There's a project in Malibu where and sorry if I'm jumping around here a bit, but that project was supposed to be a deck renovation on Broad Beach. And Broad Beach is a pretty famous street in Malibu. It's a great street to work on, to have your sign up. And that turned into a massive renovation addition and kind of re-envision of the home. And so that home was finished, and we were published on the front page of LA Times.
Wow.
And so that was really the project that kickstarted, Woods Dangaran. We were very proud of that, and it was our first project out in the office, and it was published, and it was on the front page. And so we felt, we want to use that momentum. And so from there, Santa Monica and kind of so on and so forth. But Those were the projects that got us started. I would say the project that I feel it represents Woods Dangaran would be, I mean, there's a few of them, but I think certainly I love my desert house
Oh,
in Portland.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm pretty
Um,
obsessed with that photo right there.
it's
Yeah.
a great space. Yeah, it's a great space. And so I think that's a great home. I love the Moore House, the Craig Elwood
Mm-hmm.
restoration, renovation. I think it's a fantastic space, and I think there's a quality about that space when you walk inside that is it's hyper detailed. It's like this jewel box of details, and I'm very proud of that because it's very difficult to execute the level of details that we did in that house and in an existing structure like that. So there's a handful of reasons why those two homes really are more meaningful to me. With that being said, I think there's a lot of them that I really like, but definitely the Desert House and the Moore House, the Craig Elwood House would be my favorite.
The desert house really feels like it could be on the moon. Like
The
the kind
landscape
of
is
like the
amazing.
landscape it's like you just need like
Wow.
an astronaut costume next to that house, and
Yeah. You
it's.
should have
Well,
convinced Joe
we
Fletcher
could do that. We
I think
we
you
can
should
do
go
that if
back.
you want.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
you should go
yeah.
back.
Yeah, it's great. I know Joe did the podcast with you. Joe's a good friend, and um, what a wonderful photo shoot that was with him.
Yeah.
We were able, we slept there, we stayed there a few nights, and we're able, it was such a bonding experience to understand the home, to understand the mornings, and what's amazing about that shot that everybody sees is it's really for about a 10 to 15 minute window when the sun is rising that it reflects off the brass panels,
Wow.
that it turns this sort of brass sort of hyper color.
Hmm.
And as quickly as it comes, it goes away and it becomes very homogeneous and sort of like really patina and brass. Everything's really consistent.
Hmm.
And so we saw that the day before, and Joe said, we're going to get that tomorrow. And so we were in the rocks, which is not, it's pretty scary because it's like there's rattlesnakes and,
Oh.
it's dark outside. And I'm sitting there with Joe and, we're waiting for the sun to come up. And so it's a great story. But I think the world of Joe, but he did some of his best work on that house.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
question.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it's pretty
serious
iconic
commitment.
photos right there. And the other one, the Moore House, I was wondering how difficult it is. Is it to, restore or redesign a house that had a pretty strong character, right? And part of a certain era, trying to stay authentic to its personality, but also bring like a fresh wave to it. How
It's a really great
complicated?
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an amazing question because I think that is the question for that house. We talk about that in this office all the time. And when the clients first came to us, the question was, what level of restoration versus renovation are you comfortable with, and what are you looking for? Because it's tough, and it's also working on a home like that. I realized that there was going to be a lot of opinions about
Yeah.
whether or not we did right by Craig Elwood, and and really the question for me when it comes to restoration or renovation of these types of structures is I try to put myself in the architect's shoes and how they would approach materials today with technology they have today. And a lot of these homes, whether it's Neutra, Schindler, Elwood, Ain, I think their philosophies of structure and the way they look at spaces would stay the same. But I wonder if there's an exploration of they didn't have these readily available teak panels and walnut and all this stuff at that level.
Yeah.
And so the question for us was, when does this thing transform from this mid-century home into a mid-century home that is very refined and meets the standards of the technology and kind of livability today? And so you walk a fine line because with Craig, I mean, if you look in that house, you'll see, and a lot of people don't know this, but the black banding that's around all of the wood paneling, that was consistent. That was Craig's detail.
Oh.
What's inconsistent is he used drywall, right? And so he had this black banding and inset panels of drywall, and we replaced that drywall with teak. And so that was our sort
Gotcha.
of departure point. But we made sure that Craig's detail was continued, and using the difficulty of taking a detail like that is chasing that around the whole house and then making sure, right, the consistencies with how that transitions or that dies into a wood jam or to a shower jam or whatever it might be. So it's a bit of it's a massive sort of Rubik's cube
Yeah,
in a
yeah,
way,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that's why that project, I think we're very proud of, and I think I feel like Craig would be proud of it today if he were here to see it.
Yeah,
That's
no,
really cool.
I think that house is really beautiful right now.
Because there's a tendency maybe to forget that the houses that were done at that time, a lot of the technology, I don't mean so much in terms of like digital systems or lighting systems. I mean that too, but the building technology, it was pretty rudimentary. Like it was pretty basic stuff compared to like with the installations you guys did, these super clean panels of wood that end super crisp and all these kind of details. Like those houses, the case studies, they're kind of raw.
Well, they were built fast and
Yeah.
cheap, and that was sort of a lot of the kind of that was the way that's why there's so many of them. I mean, they were built so quickly, but it's interesting. You hit on something that I talk about a lot in these mid-century homes would be I always think a lot of these homes were ahead of the technology, right?
Mm.
And that's I think that's fairly obvious in how they've how they look today, and you take them apart and there's waterproofing issues everywhere, and so what these mid-century greats were doing was fantastic, but the technology couldn't keep up with their brilliant designs.
Mm-hmm.
And so today we are very fortunate that we have this technology that can bring these beautiful structures back to life and give them another 70 years, hopefully. And in 70 years, somebody will be saying the same thing about the technology we use in that house. But
Mm-hmm.
but certainly, I think taking as simple as this as taking a mechanical system and making it work inside of that home, which is an existing structure, but hide all of that so it doesn't disrupt the architecture, right? Or redo all the plumbing and then sort of painstakingly take every piece of that redwood off and tag it as if it's a museum piece, refinish it, and make sure it goes back up exactly where it was. And so there's and doing all of that with putting all this new technology in it that we're talking about. I think it's incredibly challenging. These mid-century homes deserve it, but the architecture is not the hard part. It's actually the system inside of these homes that need to function,
Right.
especially for Title 24 and kind of climate today.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Are you guys interested or want to do more of those types of projects, like restoration, renovation, however you would describe it? Or
Yeah, we love those projects. I think we sort of characterize our practice as doing a lot of these ground up homes, but we our eyes light up when we see a potential for a historic home. We love them. They're sort of they're passion projects. I think our office loves working on them. You learn a lot from them. You can jump in the mind of these architects and you can see how these homes were built. I think the problem solving that's necessary to execute these homes is at a very high level.
Mm-hmm.
And we're working on a Buff and Hensman in Palm Springs. That's just right across the street from the Lautner House, the Bob Hope House. I don't know if you're familiar with Southbridge area. There's a lot of great architecture up there, but any chance we get to work on these historic homes, we're always very interested.
Is it hard? I'm curious. Is it hard? Are the fees good enough to cover the amount of work it takes to do this?
No.
Because I was going to say, like, you have to have some kind of benefactor who's willing to dump in a ton of money to fix these and then pay someone a lot of money to go through all the things you're describing.
Yeah, no, and that's why they're called passion projects.
Okay.
I think
Yeah.
they definitely, but I mean, for instance, something close to home, we months ago were reached out to by a couple clients that just bought an Eichler house out in Orange. And of course, I was going to do whatever it took to make sure that we did that house, and to me, it didn't matter what it was going to take. But unfortunately, the expectations for what needed to happen in the budget weren't there. And I'd still love to work on that house because it's important for me to be part of that legacy and continue to have it thrive. And I'm also very excited when I meet people who are very interested in being a part of history.
Yeah.
I think it says a lot to the client, says a lot about a client when they purchase these homes and, they become passionate about what they mean to architecture. It's really, it takes a special person to buy these homes.
Yeah, I agree.
I do love seeing an iClair that's like intact, with like all the old finishes, because it's like a museum piece, right? It's like a time capsule.
Absolutely.
Like, I love that. But it breaks my heart every time I see a picture of an iClair that was like quickly remodeled for a sale, and they
put in like white cabinets, black hardware.
The thing you just see in every single
gray.
home. And I'm like, you just missed the part here. You took value out of the property, and it just really makes me sad.
And to be honest with you, I don't fault that person because they don't know.
Yeah.
And it's a bummer because those clients that we're talking about, the ones that come to us are really few and far between. So you're going to find more of those, and it happens in Neutra houses. It happens in a lot of these homes where they've just been sort of over the years reinvented by whoever the user is, and that happens. I mean, I just hope that we can get them, put Humpty Dumpty back together again at some point.
Yeah,
it's some intense surgery.
I think the examples that first come to my mind are when realtors list the house and they come in with their quick fixes to make it more appealing to buyers, and they replace what was interesting cabinetry, dated and colored or whatever, right, with the generic transitional white and black palette, and I'm just like, oh man, you should have just left it alone. Come on.
Yeah,
I know. It was better when it was old, like, and so, but it's okay. I mean, again, I think that's part of this. Goes back to the education of architecture, and I think what the two of you are doing is contributing to that in a positive way by having these podcasts, and so people can listen to them.
Oh, thank you.
So, what was your thesis about?
Oh yeah.
So I obviously focused on Joseph Eichler, and it was about really what was interesting to me about Joseph Eichler, and it was about really kind of the mass production of housing. And because growing up where we grew up, there was a lot of tract housing, and the idea of tract housing had sort of at the time when to this point had a sort of a negative impact on, let's say, the growth of architecture. Hypothetically speaking, from a stylistic standpoint. I'm sure that's a bit of an opinion, but I think what Joseph Eichler did in my thesis was about how he found this intersection between mid-century architecture and communities and tract housing, and making and finding a way to make sure they can coexist together. And because oftentimes we look at mid-century housing or housing in general, it's modern, as something that is a one-off, which oftentimes it is. But Joseph Eichler found a way to mass produce these homes. And he said, great spaces aren't just for the wealthy, right? They can be for middle class and the working class. And I think he did a lot for challenging or opening up the eyes of many people in these homes, because if you didn't live in a Joseph Eichler, you wouldn't have known what a great space feels like. But it didn't cost his whole point, it didn't cost any more to have a great space. Right. And so I find him to be fascinating because it hasn't been replicated. Right. Yeah. I mean, at that scale and that kind of impact. And I'm not sure what the factors are behind that, but it's, it's just, he's so revered for, the post and beam and kind of these ranch style homes and atomic ranch, whatever people want to classify it as. But really it was less about the architecture. It was about him. He was one of the first to look at communities, people living in communities of homes. Yeah.
It's funny because one of the questions I was going to ask is, clearly what he created was so prolific and so widespread, and there hasn't been something on that scale again. And my question to you was, why not? Why not? And how can we? And actually, we were talking to a real estate agent recently, and he was like, he wasn't trying to recreate mid-century architecture, but he was saying, but there's these Eichler, there's these type of homes that were so cool, and they were done for middle income folks. Like, why doesn't a developer do that for the entire neighborhood now?
And the answer is money.
Mm.
I think when Eichler was doing his developments, there was the labor force was much cheaper. He was able to I believe in I'd have to go back and kind of look at this again, but he was able to combine a lot of the subcontractor pools into one, and so therefore brought the cost down.
Mm.
There was so I think there's a whole host of reasons why there's just not enough money, and that land costs have gone up so high that once you take that pro forma with the house, and also I think it has a lot to do with just having it's hard to have the discipline to create something so simple. It's very, very difficult to achieve that because it's oftentimes the mind wants more. And so, when you look at a Joseph and Eichler house, they're very simple
mm-hmm.
in form and also in floor plan. And also the livability of these homes are fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I think it's just, I don't think it's for a lack of trying, like somebody would want to do it. I think it's really just boils down to cost.
Yeah. Interesting.
It's interesting.
Sadly.
It's interesting what you said about, like the spatial quality doesn't cost more, right? That's kind of like what he said, and it's an interesting thing. Like you could spend a lot of money into building a new house, and it might be nice in the way it's finished and built, but if the space doesn't feel good, it's not right? Mm-hmm. And it doesn't cost more money to make the space feel good. It just
construction costs, you mean?
Yeah, it just takes more attention and intention to do that. Yeah,
I think that's correct. The intention is everything. And I'm sure you've both been in many spaces where there's nothing more powerful in architecture than to walk into a space and to not know why a space feels amazing, but it does. Isn't that the best feeling? And you're like, what is it about this space that is so amazing? And you're just searching high and low. And usually it's found in the architecture. It's found in like the subtlety of the nuance of the space. And I think that a lot of our homes represent that. And I think that's the way, going back to the philosophies of how we look at these homes. I mean, I think it's you have this kind of 30,000 foot view of what the architecture is, but really it's about the user standing in that space and what are they seeing and what are they feeling. And that happens through detailing, so yeah.
I had a specific question about your experience before starting your office. It seemed like a lot of your experience was working on larger scale projects. And I was wondering, did you find or do you believe that experience maybe was a reason, made you be more rigorous in how you approached your work at those offices, and that rigor carried over and that mentality carried over to single family house design? Because I think in the residential space, specifically single family, there's a larger pool of professionals, architects and contractors, everyone else, who are quite sloppy compared to when you're doing large scale work where you can't afford to be sloppy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's no question. I think that going back to the start of our office, and we often refer to these two buckets that we had. We created two buckets of the do's and don'ts. And there was a lot of do's that I took from kind of the commercial and the larger scale projects that revolved around rigor and revolved around process and presentations. And I think, there was the way that you presented in the larger scale projects it felt more intense, and it felt like there was a lot more work. And so early on in our careers, early on in our practice when we first started, I felt there was a desire for me to communicate this sense of process of work, and that was something that was different than what you were maybe seeing from some of the residential firms. So that's a great question. Absolutely.
So you guys are super successful. How big is your office? Just for some background, because I think people are kind of curious to see behind the curtain a bit.
And also we tried to do some research before the interview, and I have to say, there's nothing out there about you guys.
which I don't, anybody that knows me, that's not me.
Oh, really?
Meaning I'm really kind of all about the team members, and I'm very happy in the success of our office, but this doesn't happen without them. There's no question. I know sounds a bit like a talking point, but it's the truth. And this, there's a lot of success that's happened with the new book that was just launched. And I try to stand in the background as much as I can and let everybody else kind of come forward, because that's just how I was raised and who I am. But we have 24 team members.
Wow.
Okay.
Hopefully that doesn't surprise anyone. Sometimes we have people come meet us and they see that we have 24 and they think, wow, the work, we would have thought you would have had more. And so that always surprises us when people say that. 24 is a nice number. We'll end at 25 is really what our office is built for. I think that's where we feel most comfortable, where the two of us are involved in all the projects. We're still intimately involved.
Are you guys still in the little garage space? Or did you...
Yeah, it's one person for 6 inches.
No. So we graduated from the garage and went to, are you guys familiar with Hodges and Fung, the firm?
A little bit.
Okay. They had a bowstring truss building on the edge of Culver City. And they were kind enough to rent like 1,000 square feet to us. And when we moved into that, we thought we made it, right? This is a big place. And we quickly outgrew that place. And so about 5-6 years ago, we purchased our building in LA, 4,000 square feet, and redid the whole inside. It's a beautiful space. We spent a lot of time on it. I'm in my office currently speaking with you. But we're no longer in the office. We've sort of graduated, but we never forget where we came from. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Are you guys mostly, so 24, 25 people, right?
Sorry.
How many projects do you guys have going on at any given time?
Yeah, great question. As you both know, there are different stages of the process. So, obviously at any given time we can have typically 4 to 5 in design. Okay. Usually in construction documentation, there's really kind of more. There's between like maybe 6 and 10. Because that's where kind of a lot of the heavy lifting is happening, right? And then obviously construction administration, which obviously the projects sort of add up and they're there for a while, years. So at any given time, we probably have between around 10 projects going. 10 plus projects going at a time.
That's actually a fair, for the number you said that are in design and then CDs, that's a fair amount for 25 people. Yeah. Like you guys must be cranking out work then.
We are doing we set up a release, but some of these design, going back to our conversation about setting expectations, and we're very organized in the office with how we work through that and making sure that there's time for all the clients and every team member doesn't feel overwhelmed. And so we have a very efficient, I would say, linear process in our office that allows for us to kind of take on more. But to be honest with you, I think every architect stream is kind of less projects, but higher fees. And so, you always start off by taking more with lesser fees, and you hope that sort of counterbalances at some point that you're having less, bigger projects, less projects, but bigger fees.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Is there an ideal project in the nearer term that you guys are interested in that's residential? Like, is the objective to do, I don't know, really giant homes, like 20,000 square foot homes, or what is the interest?
Yeah, no, I think as we're getting older, or as we're just sort of developing our in the office, I think it's important for us to understand that more isn't better, more is just more. And so, these larger homes, they're difficult to work on, to be honest with you, because there's a lot of square footage in them. We find that we have a lot of those projects, but they're on larger estates now. So they're not sort of, before it's 20,000 square feet on this kind of urban infill lot. And that feels like a lot of square footage in one space. Since a lot of stuff that's on the boards that you're not seeing, since in the past, I think 3 years, we're now in 7 different states. So, so which is great. So we're in Texas, we're in Oregon, we're in Wyoming, we're in Connecticut, we're in Nevada. And so a lot of these projects that are outside of California, are these sort of estate properties, which I think, that's where we are headed towards, and that's where we've always wanted to go. I think um, it's 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 such a luxury, it's such an honor to be able to work on acreage
Right.
because the architecture becomes background,
Mm.
and it's the most beautiful form of architecture when you're in this field of trees and there's sort of this structure that begins to blend in with similar to the desert house in a way.
Yeah.
It starts to become part of this landscape. And so a lot of the new work that we're doing is in that vein. And so we're very excited for hopefully in 5 years the new book that will have more estate properties and larger scale stuff.
Would you guys be interested in doing work abroad, or have you been approached to do work abroad?
Absolutely, we have. We've been approached to work abroad. Nothing has really come from that at this point.
Uh-huh.
The right opportunity just hasn't presented itself, but we've had a few opportunities and some interesting stuff, and we hope to get there. And I think it'd be very interesting to. I'm fascinated to, because architecture has to change, and so if you're working in somewhere that has a very different culture and the architecture speaks to that culture, I think it'd be fascinating to really kind of dive into that.
Yeah, it seems like you guys are really very, very sincerely invested in kind of the authenticity of an architecture and its response to, as you said earlier, the client, the specific client, the people around it, the neighborhood, the city, and the history and everything like that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think I think you did a podcast with Faulkner, which we love his work.
Yeah.
And I think when I watched that podcast, I believe he mentioned, doing a house in a field of 100 trees and hopefully they leave 95 of them.
Yeah.
And I love that statement because that's exactly how we look at every piece of property. We're not trying to enforce our architectural will on the property. We're actually trying to listen to the property and it's the kind of site planning phase of design is oftentimes the most exciting or the most important because that's where the architecture becomes sort of, like I said, background. And so a lot of the work we're doing now, it's this idea of, I think we're really fascinated by open space and what it can do for architecture. I think that's where kind of philosophically we're headed, and it's sort of counter to some of the homes that were built maybe 20 years ago. I think it's changing the way people are wanting to live inside of a space, and so we're excited about the future there because a lot of the work that we're doing is about maybe pulling back on the square footage, but really respecting the land, and so therefore the square footage becomes that much more important.
I see. Yeah, it's interesting because there is a tendency. For most folks, and especially to developers, of course, to qualify things by quantity. So the more square footage, the better. And it kind of goes back to actually the framing views that we were talking about earlier. Like the more glass, the better. Why would I have less glass when I can have floor to ceiling and 12 foot wide and whatnot?
Well, it's a very American thing to do.
Oh, well, okay.
It is. It can be. It's a great comment. Not to go down this rabbit hole, but we talk about this, and we're trying to remove can lighting from ceilings. We find that we're trying, because the one thing that dates a house the quickest is technology, right? And putting speakers in the ceiling and putting can lights, it's like a very American thing to do. Like a lot in Europe, like there's no can lights. It's like a decorative fixture with like floor lamps, and it's a sort of soft, sort of indirect light. And so I think a lot of the ceilings there stay fairly timeless because there's not a lot of technology in the ceilings. Yeah. And so we're in this, I'm sort of challenging everyone in the office. How do we hide the lights and the speakers, which no one wants to hear, but it's certainly a conversation that, we'll continue to investigate.
That's interesting. So, that's very interesting.
Yeah, I know. We just went to one of our homes recently. That is a home that was in our book, and it's one of the older homes in our book. And the first thing that jumps out are the lights in the ceiling. Yeah. Because the technology changes so quickly now. So
hide all of the lights.
I'll walk you through one of the homes with no lights, and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's nice. Yeah.
My final question is one that I ask pretty much all of our guests these days: is what is your favorite building?
Wow. A great question. We get asked that a lot, by the way. And to be honest with you, you know, I would say the King's Roadhouse is my favorite.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Yep.
I'm not sure if both of you have been there. I'm sure you have.
They're redoing, it's
we're
undergoing a
doing,
big renovation
yeah.
like right now.
Yeah,
They're putting it on a new
yeah,
roof.
yeah. I think that that home is amazing and that property. And I think, you know, Schindler, what he did with, you know, that space and kind of creating these like outdoor courtyards, and it speaks to what we were just talking about. You know, it's sort of the void of square footage. It's about less square footage and more open space, and you just don't see that anymore. And I just every time we went there in school and every time we go there now, it still gets me. I love that home.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
I think
Yeah.
it's also easy. It was done such a long time ago.
It's insane.
Mhm.
Like a really long time ago. It was pretty
Well,
groundbreaking.
Neutra, yeah, but Neutra lived there with them, the families. I mean, there's just a lot of history there, but the the just the concrete work on that is
Mhm.
it's incredible, and the fact that they can, I mean, you can walk through. They have those like little kind of slit lights in the concrete.
Yeah.
I mean, to do that at that time was sort of groundbreaking, you know. And but more importantly, the floor plan is so simple, and it spoke to the way that they lived that time, and
Hmm.
it's you know, there's a reason why people still to this day love that home so much. It's very successful.
I have to say, the first time I went to visit that house was 12 years ago or so. And I was very confused as to what the building was. I didn't really know it was a house.
Well, it's
And
never staged as a
because it's
house.
never staged as a house. And we actually went back a few months ago for one of their events. And someone in the audience was asking, you know, the people in charge of preserving the house, like, you should one day just stage it as a house so people could see how the family, you know, used to live and occupy the space. And it kind of like, you know, just turned the light on in my head. I was like, you know what? That's why there was no furniture, and therefore it was harder for me to understand what, you know, what these spaces were supposed to be.
I think if you the history of it, I could be wrong, but I think he was very influenced by kind of camping and the idea of kind of this idea of outdoor space and so I think there's a reason why, even though it's not staged, it doesn't
Yeah.
feel like a home. I think it's very intentional.
Interesting.
Yeah, no. So hopefully that lived up to your answer for the question. But
It does. That's a
It
great
makes
answer.
a lot of sense, actually. Now that we got to know you a little bit during the interview, it makes a lot of sense.
We met,
Yeah.
this is a side anecdote, but we met the grandson of Schindler,
Yeah.
the great grandson, one of the relatives of Schindler. It's very, very fascinating, but that's
I
another
mean,
story.
it's amazing. No, that's great. But well, now I just reignited the conversation of us being mid-century architects by choosing the King's Roadhouse. So I just did myself a disservice. No. Anyway.
Brett, this was so amazing. Thank you so much for making the time. Listeners, this is in the evening on a weekday, on a Monday, actually.
Yeah.
So we really appreciate you being on the show.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this video on YouTube. If you like what we're doing, then please support our show by hitting that subscribe button and liking and commenting on our videos.
You can also find us on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're mostly on Instagram. And you can reach out to the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail. If you have any reaction to this recording, any questions you might have, or guest suggestion, feel free to send it our way.
Cool. Thank you for watching and see you next week. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.